Right now, the challenge for all parents, in light of the revelations from Everyone's Invited website, is how to talk to young people about consent, about gender-based violence. So we thought this would be a timely moment to get together and give you a few tips to help you at home. For too long, we haven't been having conversations, and we are very definitely going to have them from here on in. And having conversations with our young people about sex and relationships isn't a very comfortable one for many parents. The idea of our children becoming sexually active is pretty unpleasant, but probably marginally less unpleasant than it is the idea of us being sexually active for them. But we've got to start somewhere. I think we do need to explore with them the notion of acceptable and unacceptable behaviour, because the messaging they're getting from things like pornography, but even things like, Love Island. I mean, it's not exactly setting a great idea of what healthy relationships look like. They're getting relationships the wrong way round, because they're going in on a sexual level before they've developed a friendship, and certainly before there's any form of intimacy. So we need to talk to them about how they're doing relationships. It's about letting them know that it's not okay to send sexually explicit, unsolicited images or texts, that it's not okay to catcall, to be derogatory about somebody's body. We need to be challenging all of this behaviour and giving them a real steer on what is okay and what isn't okay, because otherwise, they're left to educating themselves in a lot less helpful and healthy ways. My advice would be always to go in gently. We don't want to go in with a whole load of what could potentially be incredibly personal questions about their behaviour, their experiences, whether they're boys or girls, because they're going, you'll see the shutters come down and the conversation closes really, really quickly. So instead, we want to make it a conversation, not an interrogation. I always say, use newspaper articles, news clips that you hear, that you might see on social media, anything that is like a third party that introduces the conversation. So it's not a kind of straight in with, well, what's your experience? What do you do? What are your friends doing? Which could be too intrusive too quickly. When you're having these conversations, put them into the third person. So in other words, instead of asking them directly, has this happened to you? You might say something like, one of the things that I read on the website was how many girls were being sexually assaulted by boys in a classroom setting. Do you think that's something that is happening in your school? So when we ask like that, we are giving them space, and by removing it from them as the first person, making it the third person, then it's less threatening for them. So we're sort of warming them up, we're getting the conversation going, and from there we can start to gauge what their experience is and also how far we can push from here. This is an incredibly complex area because there's a huge amount of educating that we need to be doing. So I just thought I'd pick out a few topics that might help you to get started. And I think the first one is about consent. I think over the course of many, many years, decades, actually, we haven't really been respectful about consent. I mean, you only have to watch a James Bond film, 007, and frankly, consent often wasn't really part of the conversation. So we are doing a big reset now, and we need to do it because we need to keep our boys safe. We need to keep our girls safe. And it's not okay for us just to carry on the way it's always been. So the reset is that if you are sitting in one of those grey areas where you're just not quite sure whether you have somebody's consent or not, always believe that the answer is a no. I always say to them, listen, you are far, far better off asking, because if you ask, first off, you're not going to go in for the kiss and have the humiliation of being knocked back if the other person isn't very keen. But more importantly, they get the opportunity to say no in advance of anything actually happening. And the really important thing is that when you hear a no, or you see a no, because it might be their body language, that you accept the no and you take a few steps back, because If you're not doing that, then actually you are breaching the rules of consent. The kind of black and white rule is that unless you are absolutely 100% sure you have somebody's consent, that they are actively consenting and enthusiastically participating, you are better off assuming that you do not have consent. Teaching young people about personal boundaries needs to start really, really early, very young actually. But by the time they reach adolescence, they should all understand that we have personal boundaries. We have personal boundaries in terms of space boundaries, how close we're happy with somebody coming towards us or not. We have personal boundaries in terms of touch. We have personal boundaries in terms of what we're prepared to share and to talk about, and that it's absolutely okay for us to have those boundaries, and we should never actually have to explain why we've got those boundaries. But they kind of need to think through what those might be, and they might not want to tell you because that might be too difficult. But encouraging them to sort of really think about it. What do you think you'd be comfortable with? How do you think you would say no? What would you do if somebody was, for example, asking you to send an explicit photograph of yourself on the internet? The golden rule is ask, don't tell. So because it needs to be something that they can manage in the heat of the moment when somebody may be putting a little bit of pressure on them, whether that's remotely, as I say, online or offline. It's got to be something that they can kind of use really quickly, and they'll be able to do that much more effectively if they've come up with the answers. We also need to teach them how to communicate those boundaries. So how do you tell another person that they are actually invading your space boundary, that they have crossed the line in terms of your touch boundary, or that actually you're not comfortable taking the conversation in the direction that they seem to want to take it? So developing a language, developing tools and techniques to help them to be able to put in those boundaries, even in the most uncomfortable of moments. As a parent of boys, as I said, we don't want to do the blaming or shaming, but we do need to educate. And also, I think really need to develop their empathy, because gender-based violence, sadly, is very much about power. So, and the power tends to be more masculine, and it's used against females and the sort of bi-trans community. How do you think it might feel if you're standing in a dinner queue right behind a girl and you get closer and closer and closer until she can literally feel your breath down the back of her neck? How do you think that might feel for her? How do you think that might be different to if you were walking behind a girl and there was a group of you as boys walking behind a girl down a street, getting closer and closer, and you're loud and there's a lot of chat going on? What do you think that might be like for her? What would that be like if that was your sister? How would you feel about it if it was me, your mum? So we need to bring them into the kind of awareness around empathy, because a lack of empathy leads to objectification, and when we objectify anything, we don't have to treat it with respect. There are going to be some people out there who are very punchy, who are able to stand straight up and go, you are bang out of order, shut it, or leave me alone, walk away. And there are going to be an awful lot who wouldn't be able to do that straight away. We have to model it, first of all. We have to talk to girls particularly about coming together as a group and changing the culture. We need to give them the language to be able to say no, stop, move back, whatever it is. I also think it's very, very important that the adults around young people, whether that's parents or school staff, are calling out bad behaviour, inappropriate behaviour where they see it. Because if we don't call it out, then we give the tacit approval for it to be repeated. And if we're not calling it out, then why would the girls or anybody else who's being victimised like that feel confident that they were going to be believed, respected and heard? So I think if you've discovered that one of your children has been a victim of any form of gender-based violence, sexual violence, the most important thing is that you don't minimise their experience. It's really important that they feel like they've been heard and that their experience has been validated. If your child has been the one who has been the perpetrator, again, shaming and blaming, not very helpful. We want to have a conversation around, how do you think that was for that person? Why did you think that that was an all right thing to do? So it becomes a discussion rather than you completely losing the plot and going at them, because nothing good comes from that at all. And perpetrators need to understand the consequences of their actions. Then they need to be re-educated into how they might do things differently, because we want them to have happy, healthy relationships, and that's not the way to start. It's not enough just to have this conversation once. This is something we have to have again and again. We just need to reset, and it's a great time to be doing it. It's a great time to be having these conversations, to be re-educating, to be able to help them to start and maintain really happy, healthy relationships. My kids, they said that I'm a bit like the mum of sex education. And you know what? That's fine by me. I might not be always quite as graphic as she is, but I've been having these conversations with them from really when they were very young, because it's so important.